Hello and a very warm welcome back to my YouTube channel. And I'm going to do a couple of videos concerning what to look out for when buying real estate abroad. In particular, if you're buying real estate as an investment purpose. Now, I want to start by saying that the point number one is you may choose either to invest abroad as a lifestyle or an investment purchase. Now, whatever you do, I think it's still important to look at this video and my next video to take into account the various points I'm going to go through. So I'll repeat number one. You have to decide firstly, is it a lifestyle purchase or an investment purchase? So for example, an investment purchase could be in a country like Cambodia, where salaries are going up, GDP has grown a lot over the last 15-20 years. But it may not be a lifestyle purchase. A lifestyle purchase could be Italy, for example, where there is less potential for growth, but it's a lovely country to buy a property in. Number two, let's look at budget. So you need to see if you can afford to buy this property. Look at your budget options. What do you want to spend? What is your risk profile if you're going for an investment property? So for example, a first property abroad could be in, let's say, a more developing market, but a pretty safe market. So for example, let's say Bulgaria could be classified as that. Or if it's, for example, not your first property abroad, you may be going for a second, third, fourth property abroad, but you want to take a little bit more risk and potentially have high reward. So somewhere like, let's say like Cairo in Egypt could be a place where you may want to put your money, because I think it's a market which will grow a lot in the future. Number three, you may want to look at to see if the prices are booming or if there's been a crash. Now, if prices are booming and are very high, it may not be a good time to buy. So potentially, for example, in some parts of the US, the markets are really, really hot at the moment, and potentially there may be a crash. Now, if you invest at the bottom of the market, let's say around 2008 in the US, you would have made a lot of money. But of course, timing is difficult. But obviously look at if there's a boom going on or if there's just been a crash in the market. Number four, I think this is potentially one of the most important, and that's demographics. So look at birth rate, population growth, population density. And I want to give an example that I did a video of quite recently. Manila fits all three. So it has a pretty good birth rate. Population growth is going to explode, so from 14 million to 24 million, and it's got a very, very high population density. So these are all good things if you want to look at the real estate market abroad as an investment. Now, there are a lot of populations in decline, in particular in Europe, is suffering a population decline. But this doesn't necessarily mean you shouldn't invest in Europe. So I'll take an example, Bulgaria. The population is declining at the moment, and it's due to decline by a fair bit. But you have to look at, let's say, cities. Now, population in certain cities like Sofia, Plovdiv and Varna are actually going up. They're creeping up. So it doesn't mean if there's a population decline in a certain country, you shouldn't invest in that country, because certain cities, the population may actually be going up. Number five, look again to see if it's a mature market or a frontier market. So a mature market, prices are not as likely to grow as in frontier markets. And that's obviously being the case because in a mature market, it's very well developed. The GDP is not likely to go up as much as in a developing country. So look into that as well. Number six, I also think this is a very important one, local affordability. Now, the property may be relatively cheap because you may be coming from, let's say, a Western European country, US, let's say Japan, investing in a foreign country. But it may not necessarily be a good investment, particularly if it's unaffordable to the locals. So you need to look at that. Look at, for example, ratios of the property price in relation to wages. And if it's very, very high, even in, let's say, a less mature market, this may be a sign that it's not a good time to buy. So I'll give an example. Perhaps Belgrade is very expensive for locals. So it may not be a good place to buy, at least in the short term. Whereas, for example, if you look at Bulgaria and a city like Varna, it's much more affordable for the locals, and Sofia and Plovdiv as well in Bulgaria. So you need to look at that as well. And local affordability, let's say, if it's becoming very stretched in mature markets, that may be a bad sign, because in the future of these markets, the GDP is not likely to grow too much. So if it's very stretched, it could be a sign that the market is about to crash. Number 7, and a very important one as well, rental yields. So don't just look at capital appreciation. Now, obviously, capital appreciation is incredibly important, but if rental yields are quite high, they may make up for any lack of capital appreciation. So it's amazing where you, even in a certain country where you have differentials. So for example, in London, the gross rental yields are about 3 to 3.5%, whereas in a city like Liverpool, they're much higher. They're actually more than double. So do look at that, even within a certain country. Number 8, and another big thing, is taxes. So higher taxation countries are much less attractive than lower taxation countries. So let's say capital gains tax in certain countries can be very high, whereas in other countries it's lower. So let's say Montenegro, Bulgaria, capital gains tax as well as rental income tax are very low. So Bulgaria is 10%, Montenegro is 9%, and this can make a hell of a difference to your investment as well. But don't just look at capital gains tax and rental income tax. Look at property taxes as well, because property taxes can eat into your profits. It can eat into your rental yields. So, for example, in many states in the US, property taxes are very high, can be as much as 2% or more, and that can really kill some of your rental yields. And also look at inheritance tax. So if you are buying abroad, inheritance tax, you could be hit with a very high inheritance tax in countries like, say, the UK. If you buy a property from abroad and you leave your property to your descendants, not your wife or your partner or your civil partner or husband, if you leave it, let's say, to a child, you could be hit above a certain threshold with a 40% tax. And it's the same in the US as well. You've got to plan that in countries like the US, where if you're a foreigner, what you call inheritance tax or death tax, whatever you want to call it, can be very high. Now, let's come to number 9, where I think this is also important. Do countries differentiate between local and foreign buyers? So, for example, in the UK, recently a 2% extra stamp duty has been added to foreign buyers. That's a differential. In many Asian countries, you cannot buy land. In, for example, Spain, if you're a non-EU EEA citizen, you'll pay rental income tax at 24% instead of 19%, and more importantly, with no deductions. So you do need to look at that as well. Number 10, is the country more pro-tenant or more pro-landlord, or if there's a differential in certain cities. So I can name, let's say, Berlin and Barcelona, which are very pro-tenant. And countries like Italy in general, France, Spain, are very pro-tenant. And the legal system is pretty slow as well to get a tenant out if they do not pay their rent. Contrast this to, for example, Texas in the US, which is very pro-landlord. Number 11, and this is something, it's amazing how people neglect this when buying a property, your buy-sell costs. So buy-sell costs in countries, let's say, like the Czech Republic, are very low, but they're very high in Hong Kong, particularly if you're a foreign buyer. So these can add 30% to your costs. So in a country like Hong Kong, your buy-sell costs could be 30 to 40%, which means you could buy a very expensive property for $1 million, and before you start and let's say if it goes up to $1.4 million, now that you may think that's a great increase of 40%, but because of the buy-sell costs, you've actually made no money. So included in this buy-sell cost, you need to look at, let's say, realtor fees or estate agent fees, as they say in Europe. That's very important too. Legal fees, registration fees, and any other fees which are involved in buying and selling the property. Number 12, I want to look at deductions as well. So deductions for rental income tax. So if deductions are, let's say, very good, as in countries like the UK, this can reduce the tax you pay on rental income. And also, if we take capital gains tax as well, there can be good deductions for example, for improvement costs, for solicitor fees, any other expenses involved in buying and selling the property. And in some countries as well, they have indexation for inflation, which can also reduce your capital gains tax bill. Number 13, an obvious one, but you've got to take it into consideration, geopolitical tensions. So, for example, we've got some tensions, let's say, between Taiwan and China. Hong Kong is another example, South Korea, North Korea. Please do take that into account when buying property abroad. Number 14, the service charge, and this is particularly relevant for apartments. So in certain cities in the world, service charges can be incredibly expensive. So let's take London. You've got to look at the service charges in some apartments in London can be £5,000 a year, which is a lot of money. Also within a country, there are certain cities that can be high. Let's say Italy, service charges are very, very high in Milan. Or if you go to the south of Italy, service charges for apartments are much, much lower. And I'll just give one other example. Downtown Dubai, in the Burj Khalifa area, service charges are very, very expensive. So you've got to take that into consideration as well. Number 15, I want to look at something which a lot of you do know that I mention in my other videos when I'm doing countries and cities, is the government debt levels. So if the total government debt to GDP is very high, this could be an indication that taxes will go up in the future. So if you buy a property with, let's say, that could have not particularly high taxes, so it could have low capital gains tax, low rental income tax. If the debt levels of the government is very, very high, and I'll give you examples like the US, Western Europe, including the UK, Japan, this could be an indication where that taxes are going to go up in the future. And this obviously will affect your gains. I'll give you an example of a country with low debt levels, government debt levels. For example, Bulgaria, where taxes are already very low. And it's unlikely they're going to increase taxes because the government debt level is so low. Number 16, how do locals actually react to foreign buyers? So let's just take 2 or 3 countries in Europe. So in Italy and Spain, they tend to be okay with foreign buyers. You actually tend to get welcomed, and people will mingle with you, in particular in cities or the countryside in Italy, in Toscana, I should say, Tuscany for English-speaking viewers. And Spain is so used to having foreign buyers that they just don't bat an eyelid. But if you're buying, let's say, in a French village, it may not be so welcoming. Now, perhaps if some of you people watching from France might say I'm being a bit unfair, but I've seen this happen with UK buyers buying in certain villages and not being particularly welcomed. Number 17, can you negotiate the asking price? Well, it actually depends. It depends on various factors. Obviously, it depends on the country. In more mature markets, the asking price tends to be very, very near the actual price that you pay for the property. In less mature markets, you may be able to ask for a bigger discount. And also in a booming market, you may not be able to ask for a discount. Whereas in a depressed market, you can ask for a heavy discount. In Spain, I've known in the past when the market was very, very, very low, 30% was not an unusual discount to ask. Number 18, briefly, I just want to talk about mortgages. Now, firstly, can you get a mortgage in the country that you're buying in? Or is it worth even looking at a mortgage in the country you're buying in? You may actually be better off getting a mortgage in the country where you have citizenship, where you're actually based. Number 19, I always look at unemployment rates as well, in particular amongst the young. And I think this is very, very important because it tells you where the country is going. So I made a video on South Africa where I said do not buy, obviously for many other reasons, but youth unemployment is so high in South Africa that to me tells me there isn't much of a future. Another area of the world, Southern Europe, unemployment, although it's nowhere near as bad as South Africa, unemployment amongst the youth can be quite high, and that also indicates that the future may not be particularly bright. And number 20, I want to look at another thing. Is the city or country you're investing in going through a regeneration infrastructure? Is there a lot of improvement? I'll give an example. Liverpool in the UK is going through a lot of development. So again, look at that as well. Anyway, this is part 1 of part 2. Thanks for today, and I'll see you very soon in part 2.